Hey folks, based on what the monster's been doing, my mind is leaning more and more towards the controller being an issue, and I'm going to try to explain why. In order to do that, I have to explain how the scooter actually works, and for most of you this will probably be useless information that you'll never need, but with my knowledge of electronics, I understand this completely. So hopefully I can put this in a simple form that will make sense to somebody who doesn't know how all this works. And so basically, when you move the throttle sends an analog signal to the controller, and based on that signal the controller puts an output to the motor, which tells the motor what to do based on the incoming signal. So most scooters will have a speed adjuster knob which will alter that incoming signal even more. In Monster's case, I don't have one of those. I have the throttle only. And interestingly, the throttle does not have an electrical contact, it's actually magnetic. So the actual moving part makes no contact with anything whatsoever. It's just got magnets in it which are picked up by a sensor, and whichever way the throttle moves, the magnetic force moves with it and tells the pickup unit the position of the throttle. So anyways, that really doesn't relate to any of this, but I just thought I'd mention that. So basically what's happening is your controller is a pulse width modulator, which means it sends pulses to the motor and it changes the width of them based on what it wants the motor to do. Yeah, that's what I'm going to try to explain here. So normally, if you just give an analog voltage, which is depending on where your throttle is, the voltage will increase, then you'll end up with something that looks like this. You go from 0 volts, and then as you work the throttle, it gradually increases the voltage till you get to the maximum of 24. It would look something similar to this. But there's reasons why that can't be used. I guess the main reason is you can't give a DC motor partial voltage, especially if it's under load, because you will actually damage the windings, and things can overheat based on not getting the power that it needs. So there's a different system that is used, and that is pulses. So what the pulses are, it's either 0 volts or 24 volts. There's nothing in between. You can't get partial voltages. It's either on or off. So you can't just turn your motor on, because it'll just spin the tires and take off, and then turn it off and then slam to a stop. So it has to be pulsed. So you get one part that goes up to full voltage for a specific period of time and comes back down to 0 volts for a specific period of time. And so what you get is a square waveform basically. So this part here in green is one full cycle. So it's off for a certain amount of time, then it's on for a certain amount of time. And that particular cycle will repeat. This is the second cycle, and this is the third. So that same cycle just continues. So in this case, half of the cycle is off, half of the cycle is on. So the motor will get 0 volts for half the time and 24 volts for half the time. So this is basically half the current that the motor will use to drive you forward or backwards or whatever. So this whole pulse is called the duty cycle, and because it's on half the time and off half the time, the duty cycle is considered to be 50% because it's doing half the work. So if you have a 0% duty cycle, then it's 100% at 0 volts. Your scooter is not moving, the motor is getting no current whatsoever. And the inverse to that is full 24 volts. Your motor is getting 100% of the voltage, the current, and duty cycle is 100%, because there is 0% that is at 0 volts. So ideally, everything in between is what the modulation is needed to do. So based on this, let's say each cycle lasts exactly 1 second. So in this case, the frequency would be 1 cycle per second, which is 1 hertz. Now, we can increase that, because the problem with that is if your motor gets a pulse every second, it's going to be quite an interesting ride, because you're going to feel every one of those pulses. So as you're driving down the street, the motor's going to be jerking, and that's not a good thing. So what they do to combat that is increase the frequency of the pulses. So if we go up to 10,000 cycles per second, which is 10,000 hertz or 10 kilohertz, you're not going to feel each individual pulse. But even though the frequency is really high, the pulse width is still 50%, so it's still on for half the time and off for half the time. It's just more times per second. So the duty cycle is still 50%, even though you're getting many more pulses per second. And you're not going to feel this. It's just going to feel like smooth power. So that's why the frequency is involved. But there's more involved than that, because that's still just on and off. So you need some way of actually regulating the speed that the motor's going. So to do that is where the pulse width modulator gets the word width from. So basically what it's doing is adjusting the width of each pulse. So if we go from a 50% duty cycle, where it's on half the time and off half the time, and reduce the on time down to 25% of the cycle, the duty cycle is 25%, and the motor's only going to get full power for 25 or 1/4 of the time that it's on, which will make the motor go slower. And the opposite of that, if it's on 3/4 the amount of time and off 1/4, it's a 75% duty cycle, and it's going to be like 3/4 of the power that the motor will use at full speed. So you get 25% duty cycle, the motor's going to be spinning a lot slower than it will at 75. So that's how pulse width modulators work. They modulate the width of the pulse, and that width determines the speed of the motor. So that's how that works. So the reason I'm saying this is because the way the monster's acting, I am thinking that my controller is going, and either the part that regulates the frequency or the part that regulates the width of the pulses, or maybe both, may be messing up. And I'm getting inconsistent pulses. When the motor decides it wants this to go really slowly, then either the frequency is slowed down or the width is narrower, so the motor's not getting full power, or the power that it's supposed to be getting. So that's my guess as to what's going on. And when the motor seems to seize up when I sit for a little while, then I try to go, I get those violent vibrations. That kind of tells me the motor's getting like strong pulses. So that's my guess. Thankfully, I do have a new controller, so I can test this. So I'm going to be putting the new controller in and basically see if that solves the problem. So I don't doubt that the motor has a problem. I know it's got problems. I don't know to what extent the motor is the issue, or to what extent the controller is an issue. But at least by changing the controller, that's going to help diagnose anything that the motor itself might be doing. Because you've seen before, when I took the brushes out to clean out the motor, it's got paste inside it, it's got oil dripping from it, so there's obviously oil inside the motor. So the motor is going to be shorting as it is, both from the oil plus all the carbon from the brushes wearing down. It's all piled up in there. So even if this does solve the problem, I'm still going to be taking the motor apart to clean all that out, because if it's not an issue right now, it's going to be eventually. So for now, I am going to be doing that. I still got another video or two to go before I actually get to that point, but I just kind of wanted to explain this now, just to give you an idea, where my thinking is and why I'm thinking the controller might be having an issue itself. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you understood what I was talking about here.